In the quiet reaches of the galaxy, far beyond the bustling trade routes and the well-known star systems, there was a small, unremarkable planet. It wasn't known for its vast resources or strategic importance. It wasn't home to a great civilization, nor did it possess technologies far beyond others. It was a peaceful world, isolated and tranquil, untouched by the chaos that often gripped the universe. But all of that was about to change. The planet's inhabitants, a gentle species known as the Thalian, had always lived in harmony with nature. Their civilization was based on cooperation, peace, and mutual respect. However, this calm was shattered one fateful day. The Thalians had received an unexpected visitor, an invader, a ruthless race of beings known as the Korg, a violent and war-hungry species, had arrived on their doorstep. The Thalians had no weapons capable of defending themselves against such a force. The Korg didn't come to negotiate or make alliances. They came to conquer. The invasion was swift and brutal. The Thalians, unprepared for such an assault, were no match for the superior firepower of the Korg fleet. Entire cities fell in a matter of hours. The Thalians watched helplessly as their peaceful world was torn apart by the Korg's merciless attacks. The air was filled with the sounds of destruction, and the once beautiful landscapes were burned and shattered under the weight of alien weapons. In the midst of the chaos, a small group of Thalians, leaders, scholars, and engineers, managed to find a way to send a message into the deep reaches of space. They didn't have the luxury of time, and they had no guarantee that anyone would ever hear their call. But they had no choice. If they didn't try, the Korg would wipe them out completely. So they sent out a desperate plea for help, a signal broadcast across the galaxy, hoping that somewhere, someone would hear it. Their message was simple, and its urgency was clear. It was a cry for help, a plea from a species on the brink of extinction. They begged for anyone with the strength to come to their aid. They called out, not knowing who or what would respond. But they knew that if help didn't arrive soon, their world would fall, and their people would be lost forever. As the message left the planet's atmosphere, it traveled through the vastness of space, moving farther and farther away from its source. It was a shot in the dark, a faint hope in a universe that had long forgotten the meaning of kindness. The Thalians waited, their hearts heavy with fear and uncertainty. They had sent the message, but would anyone answer? Little did they know that the message would reach the ears of the most unlikely responders, the Deathworlders. On a distant, war-ravaged planet known for its brutal inhabitants, a powerful and feared species lived, the Deathworlders. They were known throughout the galaxy not for their diplomacy or compassion, but for their unmatched strength and ferocity. They had a reputation for conquering and fighting, their battle skills honed through countless wars on their harsh, unforgiving homeworlds. Their planet was a place where only the strongest survived, a world where danger lurked at every corner, and every day was a fight for survival. Their warriors were unmatched, and their ships were powerful, capable of destroying entire fleets with a single strike. The Deathworlders were not known for answering the calls of the weak. They had no interest in rescuing those who couldn't defend themselves. In their eyes, survival was a matter of strength, not mercy. But something about the Thalians' message caught the attention of one of the Deathworlder commanders. A ruthless and battle-hardened warrior, known for his strategic genius and cold demeanor, was intrigued by the message. He had seen countless battles, fought against enemies far stronger than the Thalians. He had no reason to care for their fate. But as he listened to the distress signal, something stirred within him, a recognition that this was no ordinary plea. There was something different about it, something that appealed to him on a deeper level. The Thalians' desperation, their will to survive, resonated with him. They're weak, he thought to himself, but they might be worth saving. Maybe, just maybe, they could be useful. And so, despite the Deathworlders' usual indifference to the suffering of others, the commander decided to investigate. He was no fool. He knew that the Thalians might be easy to conquer, but he also saw the potential for something greater. He understood that sometimes an opportunity to demonstrate power could arise in the most unexpected places. Perhaps this was one of those moments. The message had been heard, and though it had only reached one Deathworlder, that was enough. The commander began to mobilize his fleet, preparing to answer the call. His warriors were not merciful, but they were strategic. And if there was any possibility of turning this into a battle for dominance, he would take it. The Thalians were about to learn that survival in the galaxy was not a matter of kindness. It was a matter of power. As the Deathworlder fleet began to move toward the Thalian homeworld, the Thalians waited anxiously. They had no idea who, or what, would respond to their call. Their hope hung by a fragile thread. Would their message find a savior, or would it fall on deaf ears? The answer was coming, and it would change the course of their fate forever. The Deathworlder fleet was vast, a terrifying display of power as it moved steadily across the galaxy. Its ships, massive and designed for one purpose: destruction, cut through space like a blade through soft flesh. These were beings who knew only survival and combat, born in a world where strength meant everything and weakness led to death. At the helm of this fleet was Commander Drac, a towering figure with scars marking his battle-hardened face. He was a leader who had seen countless wars, fought against enemies whose names would send shivers down the spines of most. The Deathworlders had never been concerned with helping others. Their philosophy was clear: only the strong survive. To aid another species, especially one as seemingly weak as the Thalians, was unheard of. But the message had shaken something deep within Commander Drac. He couldn't explain why, but there was something about the Thalians' desperate plea that didn't sit right with him. His mind raced. Perhaps it was because they had reached out at all. Who in their right mind would send such a message unless they had nothing left? Or maybe it was the way their voices trembled with fear, a fear he recognized all too well. Fear, in his experience, wasn't something easily faked. He sat in the command center of his flagship, staring out at the stars, the weight of the decision heavy on his chest. To answer the call would mean an enormous risk. The Deathworlders were feared across the galaxy, but they had enemies. By interfering in the conflict on the Thalians' planet, they could easily make more. Yet for reasons he couldn't shake, he felt that answering this call could be more than just a simple battle. It could be an opportunity. "We do not offer mercy," Drac muttered under his breath, "but we do offer power." His second-in-command, Kira, stood nearby, watching her leader with a steady gaze. She knew Drac well, knew that when his mind was set on something, it was almost impossible to change it. She had witnessed him lead the Deathworlders through countless wars, his tactics brutal yet effective. But this situation was different. The Thalians were not their usual foes. They were weak, helpless. Their planet had been invaded by the Xorg, a race known for its savagery and hunger for conquest. If the Deathworlders intervened, they would likely need to face the Xorg themselves, a force far beyond the Thalians in terms of power. "Commander, you know the risks," Kira said, her voice firm. "The Xorg are not an enemy to be taken lightly. The Thalians are not warriors. They are nothing like us. Are you sure you want to involve the fleet in this?" Drac turned to her, his eyes narrowing. He knew she was right. The Deathworlders had made enemies in their time, many of them, and while they were the most feared species in the galaxy, they were not invincible. The Xorg were known for their cunning and cruelty, and facing them in battle would require the Deathworlders to bring their full force. A conflict like that could spread throughout the galaxy, putting everything they had fought for at risk. "I know the risks, Kira," Drac replied, his voice low but filled with determination. "But I also know the opportunities. The Thalians may be weak, but their desperation could work to our advantage. They're a blank slate, eager for any kind of power to defend themselves. And if they want to survive, they'll have no choice but to learn from us." He paused, looking out at the distant stars again. "Imagine it, Kira, a species completely under our control, a planet that answers to the Deathworlders. This could be the beginning of something far greater." Kira remained silent for a moment, pondering his words. She could see the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had led them to victory time and time again. But she also knew that this decision wasn't just about strategy. It was about something deeper. Drac wasn't just thinking of power. There was something else driving him, something that made him want to reach out to these helpless aliens. "Understood, Commander," she said finally, nodding. "I'll prepare the fleet for departure. We'll answer the call." Drac turned to face her, a grim smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good. We'll show them the true meaning of survival." Back on the Thalian homeworld, the people could only wait. They had sent out their message, prayed for any hope, any assistance, and now it was a matter of time. Their planet had been ravaged by the Korg, their cities destroyed, and their hope hanging by a thread. The Thalians were not fighters. They were builders, creators, thinkers. They had never known war until now, and their leaders feared it might be too late. As the days passed, fear settled into the hearts of the Thalian people. Would anyone answer their call? Would anyone come to their aid? Or was their fate already sealed? The small group of leaders who had sent the message now gathered in secret. They had done what they could, but now they were powerless. And then, one morning, it came. A signal, an overwhelming, powerful signal that crackled through their communication systems. It was not from the Korg. It was something else. The message was clear. The Thalians had help coming. But it wasn't from anyone they had expected. The Deathworlders had answered the call. The stars stretched out before them, an endless expanse of cosmic wonder. Yet for the Thalians, the vast emptiness of space felt suffocating. Their world had been torn apart by the Xorg invaders, their homes reduced to rubble. Each day that passed was another day closer to their extinction. Hope had been something they once took for granted, but now it was a fragile thread, one they feared would snap at any moment. And then the unexpected happened. The signal came in, cutting through the static of their communications. It was loud, powerful, and unmistakably different from anything they had ever encountered before. The Thalians scrambled to decipher it, their minds racing with confusion and disbelief. Who was this message from? Could it be the Korg coming to finish what they had started? Or was it something else? No, it couldn't be. The Thalians' eyes widened as the message began to take shape, revealing its true source. It was the Deathworlders. At first, there was silence. The Thalians had never heard of such a species before, at least not in any of their history. The message was short, but its implications were clear. The Deathworlders were coming, and they were coming to help. The message wasn't kind. It wasn't filled with comforting words or promises of mercy. It didn't need to be. The Thalians didn't care about the tone. The message's meaning was unmistakable. The Deathworlders had answered their call. Back on the Deathworlder flagship, Commander Drac stood at the command center, his cold gaze fixed on the approaching Thalian homeworld. His fleet was vast, nearly 100 ships in total, each one capable of leveling entire planets. They were a force to be reckoned with, and now they were headed to aid a species the Deathworlders had no reason to care about. Yet, in Drac's mind, this wasn't just about kindness or compassion. This was about power. This was about making an example of the Korg and showing the galaxy just who was in control. Drac had made it clear to his crew that this mission was not about mercy. The Thalians were weak, and they would never be the same again. They would become part of the Deathworlder Empire, a conquered world that would owe its survival to their new overlords. If the Thalians wanted to survive, they would have no choice but to submit to the Deathworlder's strength. As the fleet approached the Thalian planet, Drac's mind raced with strategies. His forces were powerful, and he had every intention of using that power to crush the Korg. But he wasn't just going to fight a battle. He was going to win a war that would send a message to the galaxy. The Deathworlders rule. The Thalians, meanwhile, were preparing for the arrival of the Deathworlder fleet, their hearts torn between hope and fear. They had been saved. That much was clear. But the question remained. What price would they have to pay for this help? The Thalian leaders gathered in their last remaining city, now little more than a ruined shell of its former glory. They had hoped for a savior, someone to pull them from the brink of extinction. But now that salvation was coming in the form of the Deathworlders, a race known for their ruthless conquests and brutal ways, the Thalians felt a growing sense of unease. Their leader, a wise and respected figure named Talon, stood before a holographic map of their world. His mind raced, unsure of how to face the arrival of these terrifying allies. "Do you think they will help us, truly?" one of his advisors asked. "Or is this just another war? One that we will be forced to fight, even with the help of our supposed saviors?" Talon looked out the window at the broken cityscape. The Thalians had always been a peaceful race, never seeking power or dominance. They had always believed that kindness would prevail in the end, that peace was the only way forward. But now, with the Deathworlders approaching, Talon wasn't so sure. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but we have no other choice. The Cohorg will destroy us if we don't fight back. Perhaps the Deathworlders can show us how." Meanwhile, Commander Drax stood before his fleet, his cold eyes surveying the stars. He knew the Thalians would never understand what was coming. They wouldn't realize that their salvation came at a price that would make them dependent on the Deathworlders forever. "We'll land on their planet soon," Drax said to Kira, who stood at his side. "I want every warrior ready. The Cohorg are a threat, yes, but they are not our true challenge. The Thalians will be our true test. If they submit, we can shake them into a force of our own. If they resist, well, we'll remind them of who is in charge." Kira nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "And if they resist, we'll break them," Drax said coldly, his voice filled with icy resolve. "We'll show them that we don't offer mercy, only power." As the Deathworlder fleet descended toward the Thalian homeworld, the tension in the air was palpable. The Thalians could see the enormous ships in the sky, massive and imposing, casting shadows over the remnants of their cities. They had no choice but to hope that the Deathworlders' arrival would bring an end to the Cohorg threat. But with each passing moment, the weight of their predicament grew heavier. They were saved, yes, but at what cost? The question remained unanswered as the Deathworlder fleet began to land. The Deathworlder fleet had landed. Their ships, dark and massive, cast enormous shadows over the charred ruins of Thalian cities. The Thalians had never seen anything like it. These ships were not built for peace, nor for aid. They were built for conquest, and they radiated power. As the doors of the ships slowly creaked open, the sound echoed like a drumbeat through the air. The Deathworlders emerged, tall, terrifying figures clad in their battle armor, weapons gleaming under the distant sun. The Thalians stood in a tense silence, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had been saved, yes, but the looming question hung heavy over them. What would these warriors demand in return? Talon, the Thalian leader, stood at the front of the group, his eyes fixed on the Deathworlders. His heart raced, his hands clenched at his sides. These were the beings who had promised them salvation, but at what cost? Would they be merciful, or would their arrival herald even more destruction? Commander Drax strode forward, his massive form towering over the Thalians. He didn't look at them as one might look at fellow sentients. He looked at them like prey, something to be molded to his will. The Thalians couldn't help but shudder under his gaze. Drax's presence was enough to send a chill down the spine of even the bravest of warriors, and the Thalians, who had never seen war, were no exception. "We are here," Drax's voice boomed, cutting through the heavy silence. "You begged for help. We have answered. But remember this. The Deathworlders do not give without taking. You will fight. You will learn to survive, or you will perish. This is the price of your survival." Talon swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had hoped that perhaps the Deathworlders might offer a more diplomatic solution, But the truth was now laid bare. They had come to fight, not just to help, but to make the Thalians a part of their ruthless machine of war. "We will do what we must to survive," Talon replied, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "We are not warriors, but we will learn." Commander Drac gave a slight nod, as though he had expected this answer. His cold eyes never left Talon, scrutinizing him as if sizing up his worth. He didn't need to hear more. The Thalians' words were insignificant. He could see their fear, and it amused him. The weaker species were always fearful, always submissive in the face of true power. That was why they were weak. "Good," Drac said, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "Then your training begins now." Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, the Korg ships approached. Their arrival was not subtle. Unlike the silent Deathworlders, the Korg ships blared across the skies with an ominous hum, their dark silhouettes cutting through the atmosphere like sharks gliding through water. The Korg were a monstrous race, built for nothing but destruction. Unlike the Thalians, who relied on intelligence and diplomacy, the Korg solved problems with violence. And now, they had set their sights on the Thalians once more. The Deathworlders, despite their reputation, were not enough to deter the Korg. The Korg were never afraid of anyone, not even the most powerful forces in the galaxy. Captain Thrak, the leader of the Korg fleet, stood at the helm of his flagship, a hulking vessel adorned with spiked armor and jagged edges. His yellow eyes gleamed with an almost unnatural fury as he looked down at the Thalian planet. His mind was focused solely on one thing: the extermination of the Thalians. They had resisted him, and now they would pay. But something had changed. He had received word of the Deathworlder fleet's arrival, and it unsettled him. The Deathworlders were no easy prey. They had been rumored to be one of the most fearsome species in the galaxy. If they had come to fight on the Thalians' behalf, then things would not be as easy as he had originally planned. "We will crush them," Thrak growled, his voice low and menacing. "The Deathworlders, the Thalians, it does not matter. They will all bow to the Korg." He turned to his second-in-command, a large Korg warrior named Scar. "Prepare the fleet. We engage immediately. The Thalians will not escape this time." Scar nodded, his sharp teeth glinting in the dim light of the command deck. "Understood, Captain. We will wipe them out." Back on the Thalian homeworld, the Deathworlder fleet's landing had created chaos among the Thalians. Some tried to organize resistance, but their lack of combat training was painfully evident. They were not soldiers. They had no experience with warfare, and the sight of the Deathworlders, those who had come to help, only furthered their fear. Drac watched the scene unfold with a cold smile. These weaklings would learn, or they would die. He had no interest in their survival unless it served his purpose. His fleet was ready to engage the Korg, and he was not about to let a bunch of helpless aliens get in his way. The ground shook as a rumble echoed through the planet. The Korg had arrived. Commander Drac turned to Kira, his second-in-command, his voice icy with determination. "Prepare the troops. The Korg are here. We're not just protecting the Thalians now. We're taking the fight to them." Kira's eyes flashed with excitement. She had seen the Deathworlders' strength firsthand, and she knew what Drac was capable of. The Korg wouldn't stand a chance against them. But Drac's smile faded as he thought about the Thalians. They would need to be ready for this fight, and he had no intention of holding back. Not now. Not when the stakes were so high. "Today, we show them who is truly in control," Drac muttered. And with that, the Deathworlder fleet prepared for battle. The Korg would learn that crossing the Deathworlders had dire consequences. The air was thick with tension. On the surface of the Thalian planet, the ground trembled beneath the weight of the approaching storm. Deathworlder and Korg fleets hovered above, their ships darkening the skies. The Thalians, for the first time in their peaceful existence, were forced to face the unimaginable reality of war. There was no turning back now. Commander Drac stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Deathworlder vessel towering over the Thalian city below. His eyes were narrowed, calculating every movement as his troops prepared for the coming battle. The Thalians, still unsure of what their alliance with the Deathworlders truly meant, could only watch as the brutal warriors around them readied their weapons. "We fight for survival," Drac muttered under his breath. The Deathworlders never fought for anything less. In his mind, the Korg were an obstacle, a challenge to be destroyed. But the Thalians, they were something different. They weren't just allies now. They were part of his plan to reshape the galaxy. Kira, his loyal second-in-command, stood beside him, her gaze focused on the approaching Korg ships. She had seen battles before, countless times, but there was something about this one that felt different. The Thalians weren't soldiers, and she knew it would be up to the Deathworlders to fight the bulk of the battle. "They're coming," Kira said, her voice a calm contrast to the tension that gripped the room. Drac didn't respond immediately. His mind was already 1,000 steps ahead, calculating every possible move. He turned sharply to one of his officers. "Launch the fighters. I want the Korg to feel the power of the Deathworlder fleet." As the order was given, a deafening hum filled the air as hundreds of fighter ships began to launch from the Deathworlder flagship. Their engines roared to life, cutting through the sky like streaks of lightning. The battle had officially begun. On the surface below, the Thalians were paralyzed by fear. Talon, their leader, stood at the head of the few warriors they had managed to train in the short time since the Deathworlders arrived. He had no weapons, no armor. All he could do was watch as the chaos unfolded around him. He felt the heavy weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He had led his people to this point, but he wasn't sure if they could survive. A Thalian scout ran up to him, breathless. "Talon, the Korg ships are landing. They've begun their assault." Talon's eyes widened, and his heart raced. The Thalians were no match for the Korg. He knew it. But just as fear began to take over, a thunderous roar shook the ground, followed by an explosion that sent debris flying into the air. The Deathworlders had engaged the Korg. Above, the Deathworlder fleet's fighters engaged the Korg ships in a ferocious battle. The sky erupted with flashes of light as laser beams collided, creating explosive bursts that rippled through the atmosphere. The Korg fought viciously, but the Deathworlders were faster, stronger, more skilled. It was clear from the first moments of combat that the Deathworlders were the superior force. Drac stood, watching the battle unfold. His fleet was in perfect formation, a seamless display of raw power. Each ship in the Deathworlder fleet moved with deadly precision, cutting through the Korg forces like a blade through paper. The Korg were outmatched, their ships crumpling under the Deathworlder assault. Kira's voice broke through his thoughts. "The Thalians are ready for their part in the battle. We've trained them well enough to hold their own." Drac glanced over at her, his expression cold. "Let's see if they can survive their first real fight." On the ground, the Thalians were scrambling to keep up. With their limited training, they had no hope of facing the Korg head-on. But they had something the Korg didn't: Deathworlder training. The Deathworlders had equipped them with armor, weapons, and the resolve to fight. It was all they had to survive. Talon gripped the hilt of the weapon the Deathworlders had given him, a massive energy sword that felt alien in his hands. He'd never wielded a blade like this before, but there was no time to hesitate. The first wave of Korg soldiers had already reached the outskirts of the city, their grotesque forms moving quickly toward the Thalians. "Get ready," Talon shouted to his people, his voice stronger than he felt. "We hold the line." He stepped forward, energy sword raised high, and charged into the fray. The Thalians followed, their feet heavy but determined. Despite their fear, they stood beside the Deathworlders, ready to fight. The clash was brutal. The Korg were relentless, attacking with vicious ferocity. Their massive claws tore through Thalian defenses, but the Thalians fought back with the weapons they had been given. Talon's sword slashed through the air, cutting down a charging Korg soldier. The weapon was heavier than he expected, but its power was undeniable. Each strike felt like it could end the fight in an instant. But the Thalians weren't prepared for the Korg's brutality. One by one, the weaker fighters fell. Blood spilled across the streets, and the stench of burning flesh filled the air. Talon's heart pounded, and his breath came in ragged gasps. But there was no turning back. They couldn't retreat. They had to stand their ground. And just as it seemed the Thalians might be overwhelmed, the Deathworlder reinforcements arrived. The ground shook as massive Deathworlder tanks rolled into the fray, their heavy cannons blasting through the Korg ranks. The Deathworlder's warriors descended, moving like shadows, their weapons cutting down Korg soldiers with brutal efficiency. With a final roar of fury, Commander Drac and his elite warriors stormed the battlefield. The Korg, already on the back foot, faltered in the face of the Deathworlder onslaught. In a matter of minutes, the tide had turned. The Korg were being pushed back, their assault crumbling under the weight of the Deathworlder assault. Talon, still fighting at the front, turned to see the Deathworlders charging forward, his heart filled with a mixture of awe and dread. The Deathworlders were unstoppable, but now the fate of the Thalians was even more uncertain. Would they survive this battle only to become servants of the Deathworlders, bound to them in servitude forever? Drac stood at the edge of the battlefield, his expression cold and unwavering. He surveyed the carnage around him. The Korg were retreating, but the cost of victory was clear. His fleet was ruthless, yes, but he knew the Thalians had paid a heavy price for their survival. "Victory is ours," Drac said softly, turning to Kira. "But they will never forget what we've done for them. The Thalians owe us now, and they will learn that a debt to the Deathworlders is never forgotten." The ground was littered with debris, the bodies of both Thalians and Korg scattered across the battlefield. The air, thick with smoke and the stench of burnt metal and flesh, hung heavy in the silence that followed the brutal clash. The once pristine cities of the Thalians were now scared by the ravages of war, the streets cracked and burning, homes reduced to rubble. The Korg had been defeated, but the cost was far greater than anyone had anticipated. The Thalians, despite their fierce resistance, had lost many in the battle. Their warriors, though valiant, were no match for the vicious onslaught of the Korg, but they had managed to hold the line, barely. As the smoke cleared, they looked to the horizon and saw the Deathworlders standing victorious, their towering forms still silhouetted against the fading light. Commander Drac stood at the edge of the battlefield, surveying the destruction. His armored form was as imposing as ever, but his gaze was cold and calculating. The Deathworlder fleet had decisively crushed the Korg threat, but now there was the matter of what came next. The Thalians had survived, yes, but they owed their survival to the Deathworlders. And in the eyes of Drac and his people, that meant they were now bound by a debt. Kira, standing beside him, adjusted her weapon belt, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. She had seen many battles, but this one felt different. The Thalians, for all their bravery, were still weak. They had fought well, but they were not warriors, not yet. And now, it was time to make them into something more. "They've learned their lesson," Kira said, her voice low, almost pensive. "But they'll need more training, more guidance. We can't just leave them like this." Drac's eyes narrowed. "No, they need to understand what it means to be truly strong. They must be forged in the fires of war, just like we were." Talon, the Thalian leader, approached them, his steps slow and heavy. His once clean armor was now smeared with dirt and blood, but his resolve had hardened. He had seen his people suffer, and he knew that if they were to survive in this brutal galaxy, they needed to adapt. He stopped before Drac, his head bowed in respect. "We owe you everything. Without you, we would have been destroyed." Drac's gaze was impassive as he met Talon's eyes. "You owe us more than gratitude, Thalian. You owe us your loyalty. You are not just our allies now. You are our soldiers. The galaxy is a cruel place, and it will not hesitate to destroy you the moment you show weakness. Talon hesitated, but he knew there was no other choice. His people had seen the true face of war today. They had witnessed the brutality of the Deathworlders and understood that they had no hope of survival without them. To refuse this new reality was to guarantee extinction. "I understand," Talon said, his voice resolute, though the weight of the words hung heavily on him. "We will fight. We will learn. But we will not be your slaves." Drax's lip curled into a thin smile, a cruel twist that showed his sharp teeth. "We will see, Thalion. In time, you'll understand that loyalty and servitude are often one and the same. You may believe you fight for your people, but you will fight for us too. You have no choice. The galaxy will not give you another chance." As the days passed, the Thalions began their transformation. The Deathworlders trained them relentlessly, teaching them how to fight, how to survive. But it was not enough to merely teach them how to wield weapons. The Deathworlders taught them how to endure pain, how to push beyond their limits, how to rise from the ashes of destruction, and continue fighting. Drax watched with a careful eye as the Thalions struggled. Some embraced the harsh lessons, pushing themselves to their breaking point and beyond, while others faltered. The weaker ones, those who could not adapt, were discarded, left behind to fend for themselves. It was a brutal reality, but it was the Deathworlder way. The Thalions, for their part, began to understand the cruelty and the necessity of it all. They began to harden, to see the world through the same ruthless eyes as their Deathworlder instructors. The pain and suffering they endured became part of their new identity. They were no longer a peaceful race. They were warriors, born of necessity. Talon, who had once been a symbol of hope and peace for his people, now stood at the front of the training grounds, a sword in hand. His face was etched with the scars of battle, and his once soft eyes had turned cold. He had no illusions left. He knew that to survive, he had to fight. He had to lead his people into this new brutal reality. Yet, even as the Thalions trained and fought, the shadow of the Korg still loomed over them. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The galaxy was full of dangers, and the Korg were only one threat among many. The Deathworlders had given them a taste of what true power meant, but they would need to fight for every inch of it. Talon knew that their survival depended on their ability to adapt. They could no longer rely on diplomacy or hope. They would have to become just as merciless, just as relentless as the Deathworlders. Meanwhile, across the stars, the Korg were regrouping. They had been defeated on the Thalion homeworld, but they were far from finished. Captain Thrak, the ruthless leader of the Korg, paced across the deck of his flagship, his yellow eyes burning with hatred. "They will pay," he hissed, his voice full of fury. "The Thalions, the Deathworlders, none of them will escape the wrath of the Korg. I swear it." His second in command, Scar, stood silently by his side, awaiting his orders. "What will we do next, Captain?" Thrak paused, his eyes narrowing. "We rebuild. We gather our forces. The Thalions may have won this battle, but they haven't seen what true war looks like. The Deathworlders may have their strength, but they will soon learn that the Korg are not so easily defeated." He turned toward the massive viewport, staring out into the cold, endless void of space. "The galaxy will tremble at our wrath. This is not over." Back on the Thalion homeworld, Talon stood alone on a cliff, overlooking the horizon. His people were training, preparing for the unknown. But in the pit of his stomach, a sense of unease gnawed at him. The Korg were not defeated for good. And the Deathworlders, he didn't trust them entirely. They had saved them, yes, but what was the price for that salvation? His thoughts were interrupted by the voice of Commander Drax, who had approached from behind. "You're worried, Talon. Good. That means you're thinking. But you shouldn't be. The Deathworlders will always be there. You have our strength now." Talon turned slowly to face Drax, his expression unreadable. But at what cost? Drax's cold eyes met his. "Survival," Thalian. The cost is always survival. The Thalian homeworld was slowly rebuilding. The cities now full of the hustle and bustle of warriors and civilians working together. The scars of war, though deep, were beginning to heal. The Deathworlder fleet remained in orbit, an ever-present reminder of the price the Thalians had paid for their survival. The Thalians had become soldiers, hard, unyielding and scarred, but still struggling to reconcile with their new reality. They were no longer the peaceful people they once were, but they were not yet the ruthless killers the Deathworlders wanted them to become. Talon stood in the war room, his eyes scanning over the holographic maps of their homeworld, now dotted with Deathworlder-controlled bases. The once vibrant and peaceful planet had become a training ground for war. Everywhere he looked, there was the sound of metal striking metal, the crash of weapons training, and the harsh commands of Deathworlder officers instructing his people. The Thalians had learned quickly, but no amount of training could change who they were at their core. Talon had begun to feel the weight of the responsibility that came with leadership. He had led his people into this war, and now he had to lead them out of it, if such a thing was even possible. He was interrupted by the appearance of Commander Drac. The Deathworlder was as imposing as ever, his armored form towering over Talon as he approached. "Are you ready for the next phase?" Drac's voice was low, laced with the gravity of the question. Talon met Drac's gaze, his mind heavy with doubt. "I'm not sure any of us are ready, but we have no choice, do we?" Drac's cold smile was a reminder of the harsh reality the Thalians now lived in. "No, you don't. The galaxy doesn't care if you're ready. It only cares if you're strong, and you're only as strong as the alliances you build." Talon couldn't help but feel a flicker of resentment, but he swallowed it. Drac was right. They had no choice but to keep moving forward. Elsewhere, across the galaxy, the Korg were far from defeated. They were regrouping and rebuilding in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back at the Thalians and the Deathworlders. Their wrath, though temporarily stifled, was building. Captain Thrak stood on the bridge of his warship, staring out into the cold expanse of space. His yellow eyes gleamed with fury. The defeat they had suffered on the Thalian homeworld had been humiliating, but it had only made them stronger. He had learned much from the Deathworlders' tactics, and now he was ready to apply those lessons. "They'll regret this," Thrak hissed to his second-in-command, Scar. "The Thalians may have survived this battle, but the Deathworlders will fall. We'll show them the true meaning of pain." Scar nodded, a glint of anticipation in his eyes. "The galaxy will hear our fury." Back on the Thalian world, Talon stood with his people, watching as the next phase of the Deathworlders' training began. They were no longer just training for survival. They were training for something greater, an army capable of taking on any threat the galaxy could throw at them. Talon had made a difficult decision. After much thought, he had chosen to join forces with the Deathworlders, to fight alongside them. The Thalians would never return to their peaceful ways. The galaxy had shown them that. Now, their only hope was to be stronger, stronger than the Korg, stronger than any enemy that might come for them. But Talon knew that there was a cost to this power. The Deathworlders had given them everything: the strength to survive, the tools to fight. But nothing came without a price. As the weeks passed, Talon saw the changes in his people. Some embraced the new order, relishing in the power that came with their new training. Others resisted, struggling with the loss of their old ways. But the reality was clear: those who could not adapt would perish. In the midst of this transformation, Talon began to question everything. The Deathworlders had saved them, but had they done so out of kindness, or was there something more? What did the Deathworlders want from the Thalians? The galaxy was a ruthless place, and Talon knew that the Deathworlders expected more than just gratitude. One evening, as the sun began to set over the war-torn Thalian landscape, Talon took a walk to the edge of the city. The sky was painted with the colors of twilight, but the serenity of the scene only served to deepen his sense of unease. He sat down on a large rock, looking out over the land. He could hear the faint sound of weapon drills in the distance, the echo of a civilization in the midst of change. Talon's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden appearance of Kira, Drax's right hand.